I have lived with Colonel Foster for 40 years. I labored hard. I feel sad to think of leaving my children behind. I hope by God's assistance to recover them. A glance at our land shows abundance that cannot be counted. It is graced with eternal valleys and mountains. I was born Abdul Rahman of Futa Jalon. I lived with my wife and child in the capital, Timbo. A journey of 2 moons from Timbuktu, where I once studied. My father was Sori, king of Futa Jalon. At 26, my father gave me command of 2,000 men and sent me to protect our way to the sea. We defeated our enemies, and I hurried back with a few men to report to my father. We were ambushed. We heard the guns. We saw the smoke. And my men dropped like rain. Fearing my father's revenge, they dragged me and my men to the sea. They bound me, pulled off my shoes, made me go barefoot 100 miles, and led my horse before me. They sold me to slave traders on an English ship for 2 flasks of powder, some muskets, 8 twists of tobacco, and 2 bottles of rum.
Chained and crammed into the hold of a slave ship, Abdul Rahman made a harrowing Atlantic crossing, unaware of what lay before him.
The sea abounds with sharks of a very large size, which are often seen in almost incredible numbers about the slave ships, devouring with great dispatch the dead bodies of the Negroes as they are thrown overboard. Alexander Falconbridge, ship's surgeon.
All hands to Harriet!
The Africa was en route to the Americas to feed the New World's hunger for slave labor.
This morning buried a woman slave Number 47. Know not what she died of, for she had not been properly alive since she first came on board. Captain's log, John Newton, slave trader.
Years earlier, Portuguese ships prowled the west coast of Africa in search of gold and fortune, offering manufactured goods like muskets for trade, and setting in motion a cruel race for guns that fueled the cycle of war among the local nations. Africans themselves became the currency of choice for the Europeans.
If you wanted to get your hands on firearms, the only way to get that would be to trade with Europeans, and the only currency, if you will, that they would accept were captives.
If you look around the world in the late 18th century, more than 3/4 of the people on Earth were in slavery or servitude of one kind or another. Just go left to right across the globe.
Expanding colonial plantations produced an insatiable demand for slave labor.
This North Atlantic slave trade distorted and made slavery something qualitatively different and exponentially more brutal than what was known in African societies.
This was the largest forced migration in human history, draining away some 12 million people in 400 years.
It was a trade that seemed to make the world go round, that was part of the world's economy, but it was nonetheless something absolutely horrible.
Stacked like cords of firewood inside the ship's dark hold, Abdurrahman and 170 other slaves crossed 3,000 miles of ocean before he was sold again and carried across the Gulf of Mexico and up the Mississippi River to the Spanish port of Natchez.
I could see this was a big port and a big city, but it looked smaller than Timbo. The buildings were not well built, like at home.
As a rough and tumble town on the frontier, this being a jumping off place to the west, it also had that kind of frontier character. The people came here, they were going to make their fortune, and this was the frontier.
8 months after his capture, the Prince of Fouta-Djallon stood on the Natchez docks with other goods for sale or trade.
You come on! Get going here! Get going! Come on now, come on!
Saturdays were a big business day for the region, and local farmers headed to the docks to purchase the manpower needed to clear the wilderness. They were an unsophisticated bunch.
Come look, come look, come look! Step up here, come.
Most were illiterate, and they rarely paid in cash. Usually they'd mortgage their purchases against future tobacco crops.
Look at the backs on this one. Give me a bid. Any more bids? Any bids? Any higher?
One of the farmers who had come to see what was brought to Natchez was Thomas Foster. Thomas Foster was a hard-nosed businessman, a hard worker physically, religious-minded in his way, and very ambitious.
Come on, open up. Open up. I kind of think of him as a Calvinist. He was not a flamboyant fellow. He was out here trying to put together a place to live for his family and build his personal wealth. He had a very, I think, a predestinarian kind of view of where he should be.
930 is as high as I can go. Take it or leave it.
930.
What you're essentially doing is you are removing the identity of an individual.
$930.
$930 sold. Two fine Africans.
And you are giving him a very different identity, one that you as a slaveholder choose. And this communicates very effectively that the person is now a slave. The person is now chattel. The person is now someone who is owned.
Sepan cuantos esta carta vieren, como yo, Thomas Edwin,
I, Thomas Edwin,
realmente y con efecto, a Thomas
hereby
Foster,
sell to Thomas Foster 2 brute Negroes for the sum of 930 pesos,
y quedarán hipotecados hasta el entero
and they will remain mortgaged until they are paid for in full.
For a little hard cash and 2 promissory notes, Foster purchased Abdurrahman and Samba, one of his soldiers. Foster had no idea who Abdurrahman was, nor did he care. His only concern was that the long-haired African with no apparent disease or injury would work his land and justify his investment.
After the purchase was completed, Abdurrahman headed to the Foster farm. Foster was a native of South Carolina who had immigrated to the Natchez district just a few years earlier. He had come with his mother and 3 older brothers. They had come because the Spanish government, in trying to build up the population of the region, was giving grants of land to people who would take and develop it. We don't want to think of this as a plantation. It was probably just a few acres and fence, muddy with stumps and chopped down trees.
I had seen at the market that Mr. Foster had money. I could scarcely believe that they had to live in the wilderness like this.
Compared to the raw Mississippi frontier, there were a number of highly developed West African kingdoms, some as large as the American colonies. One of the most prominent was Fouta Djallon. Headed by an Islamic al-Mami, a freely elected leader who ruled from the capital of Timbo, a strategic trading center.
This was a period of real intellectual expansion. They had a constitution, they had laws. This was a very sophisticated society.
Though they were herders and craftsmen, they were also caught up in the transatlantic slave trade and fought wars and traded captives for European goods and firearms.
They saw themselves as above everyone.
Go and fetch Manoa, boy. Go on.
So even when the Europeans came, they felt they were superior to these European barbarians.
I tried to tell Mr. Foster that I was a prince in Africa and that my father the king would pay him for my return 2, 3 times what he had paid for me.
Go on.
Mr. Foster paid no attention to my words, except to mock me. From that time, he called me Prince. Eight months before, I had left Timbo as Prince of Fouta Djallon and commander of its armies. I was torn from my family, from my wife and my son. I had traveled a great distance, and now my journey was at an end.
I await the much-needed mare and a 1-year-old chicken. Today at the market, I purchased 1 sack of salt, 1 lady's horse-skin mitts, and 2 Africans. They'll clear the north fields, down by the old barn.
Slaveholders seasoned their new slaves, forcing them to learn English, stripping them of their customs and identities. The Africans, many of whom were Muslims, were kept from practicing their religion. Those who resisted were severely punished.
I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to. Come on. Come on.
The first order of business for Thomas Foster was getting some new clothes and a haircut for his new African.
Stop.
This meant, of course, cutting off the long hair that he wore, an ornament of great beauty in Fouta-Djallon. And Abdul Rahman told a friend, under normal circumstances in his own country, he would have parted with this hair only with his life.
Here he is, sheared of his hair, which was a sign of their nobility, and forced into menial labor.
Abdul Rahman refused to clear the fields. Defiance, in turn, brought the whip and deepened his resentment. He saw only one way out, and he took it. Announcements of Abdul Rahman's escape were posted at the fort, at taverns, and all public places. Boatmen were alerted for river crossings, and slave hunters searched the thick woods. But no trace of the tall African was found. Days stretched into weeks.
All efforts to ascertain his whereabouts proved unavailing, and after a while, inquiry was abandoned. Major Steve Power, decorated veteran of Natchez.
Abdul Rahman had no place to go. He realized his return to Fouta-Djallon was impossible. Half-starved, exhausted by sleepless nights, he struggled to come to grips with his past, the battles he had waged, the men he had lost, and slaves he had traded.
During the isolation of being alone in the wilderness, it dawned on him that he is no longer a prince. He's no longer a warrior. From that point onwards, his dignity was based on his ability to master the circumstances that he was in.
Someone brought up in Fouta-Djallon believes that on the day you're born, God knows and numbers every day of your life. And this fate, however cruel it seemed to him, was part of a divine plan. His resignation to the will of God was demanded.
After weeks on the run, Abdul Rahman returned to Foster's farm.
Thomas Foster's wife was named Sarah. The story that her granddaughter told was that she was sitting in her home sewing when she looked up and saw Abdul Rahman standing at the door. He lay down on the floor and put her foot on his neck. Now that was a sign in West African warfare of submission, and it often preceded a spear thrust to the heart. He was showing in his actions something that he didn't have the words in English to say, and that was, "Here I am. If you want to kill me, go ahead. I'm back."
When captured, most runaway slaves faced harsh and merciless abuse. But the voluntary return of his mortgaged slave came as such a financial relief that Foster imposed no punishment.
At this point, he resigns himself to his fate, doing whatever jobs Foster assigned him and beginning his new life in America.
Mississippi planters are but a plain, practical body of men. They would rather gaze upon an acre of cotton than upon a magnificent garden. Still, planters are not devoid of taste. It is just to their desire to make it yield interest rather than beauty.
Though not well educated, Thomas Foster was a shrewd businessman who capitalized on Abdurrahman's knowledge of cotton grown in Fouta Djallon.
Foster got into the cotton business early. The indigo was attacked by insects. In the case of the tobacco, the price supports were lowered, and Foster was wise in moving into cotton.
Abdurrahman's familiarity with the crop enabled Foster to plant on a large scale, producing almost 16,000 pounds of cotton in his first year. The Fosters quickly became one of the leading cotton families in the area. As the farm swelled to a sprawling plantation, Foster purchased more slaves, paying this time with hard cash, and counting on Abdurrahman's natural leadership to get the most from his investment.
Vendo realmente y con efecto a
I
Thomas
hereby sell to Thomas Foster without further obligation or mortgage 4 slaves, all natives of the United States.
Isabel,
Isabella, 25 years of age. Jacob, 10 years of age. Anaki, 5 years of age. And Lomanique, 2 years of age.
Prince, this is Isabella. She doesn't know nothing about cotton. I want you to show her how we work the fields here in Mississippi.
Yes, sir. I show you how to work Foster's fields. First you take the stick. Make it hole. You take the seed, cover it up.
In Isabella, I see a woman, though bereft of most things, retain the ability to choose who she loved and who she wanted to be with. I can't minimize the force of her own personal will and dynamism and the force of their attraction for one another.
7 years had passed since Abdurrahman last saw his wife and child. He had given up hope of ever seeing them again.
He had to overcome that love, that separation, then open up his heart to another who also could have been taken from him. It was a tremendous risk for both of them. To love in that kind of situation was risky.
Father in heaven, you ordained marriage for your children. We present to you Isabella and Prince, who are here this day to be married.
Marriage was not a legal right granted to slaves, but Foster believed that a ceremony would create a sense of stability on the plantation. For Abdurrahman, a Muslim, and Isabella, a Christian, the ritual was a testament of their love and commitment to each other.
They made the best they could of their circumstances. They found ways to figure out forms of solidarity, forms of resistance, forms of accepting what was going on, including obviously religious forms of acceptance, in order to live their lives.
If you have faith, you will think that all of this happened for a reason that you don't know. But ultimately, things will get better.
The world moved on. Abdurrahman rose to a position of authority on Foster's plantation, and Foster allowed him to earn money of his own by growing vegetables to sell at the market.
He was the person who the other Africans looked up to because he was a leader there, and he continued to be here and see that things got done. And he wasn't made overseer, he was the de facto overseer. After all, a significant number of the slaves were his own family.
Ultimately, there would be 5 sons and 4 daughters born to them. Each one of these children tied a heartstring between himself and the land of his enslavement.
Hey, sweetie.
I just know you're gonna sell all these today. Maybe we could buy a little something for the children with the money.
It's just another day at the market. But we'll see.
Mom, should we feed the chicken some more?
The crossroads near Natchez-town was an open marketplace where it was acceptable for slaves and slaveholders to trade with each other.
Fresh Sunday, good Sunday dinner.
Beyond the makeshift stalls, the two rarely intersected socially, except on Sunday, market day.
Yes.
On one particular Sunday in 1807, an extraordinary event would shift the course of Abdurrahman's life once again.
Fresh yet? Go to that man. See if he has one eye. If he does, I know him. One eye and black patch.
His name was John Cox. He served as a ship surgeon on an English vessel. He had gone ashore, and when he could not be found, his ship sailed without him. He fell ill and stayed for 6 months with the greatest hospitality. He was the first white man to reach Timbo.
Boy, where do you come from? I come from Foster's place. You weren't born in this country? No. I come from Africa. From Timbo? Yes. That is my home. And is your name Abdul Rahman? Yes. That is my name. Do you know who I am? I know you very well. You are Dr. Cox. Dash down your potatoes and come to my house. I cannot leave my potatoes.
I had not seen Dr. Cox since I was a young man in Timbo. He had many questions. He asked how I had come to this country, how I had come to Mississippi, how I had come to be a slave.
Dr. Cox was a freethinker, a respectable physician who was described by prominent residents of Natchez as a man of some eccentricity.
Mr. Foster, is it?
Yes.
Pleasure to make your acquaintance. John Coates Cox.
What is it, Mr. Cox? Dr. Cox?
You have in your possession the one you call Prince. Many years ago, on the west coast of Africa, I was saved by an African prince, Abdul Rahman.
Wait, sir. You're saying my prince actually is an African prince?
That's exactly right, sir. And I never thought I'd be able to pay my debt until today. Sir, I am here to ask for the release of Abdul Rahman into my care.
I'm sorry, sir. Prince is not for sale.
I understand that the going rate is $550 or so.
Sir, you don't understand. Prince is not for sale. His wife is here. His children are here.
I beg you, sir.
I
will
cannot
offer
help you, Dr. Cox.
$1,000.
Prince is
sir.
not for sale at any price.
But, sir...
Good day to you, sir.
It did become the talk of the town, and I suppose in some sense that it made Foster feel like he was the man who controlled a prince.
I believe Thomas Foster rejected the offer because Abdul Rahman had simply made himself indispensable on the Foster farm. Despite the cheer of the family, the confidence Foster had in him, and the friendship of Dr. Cox, he paid a very, very hard price for his accommodations.
Foster prospered. His property expanded dramatically to 1,700 acres. 40 adult Africans now worked the plantation from sunup to sundown, making him richer with each season. Dr. Cox continued to seek Abdul Rahman's freedom, but Foster flatly refused. When Cox died in 1816, his son took up the cause, but Foster stood firm. For years after Cox's death, people talked about the unlikely meeting between the Irish doctor and the African prince. This notoriety opened doors to Abdul Rahman that were closed to most black men.
Alam Ayohalahu Al Habib Al Kari Al Habib.
Show me what you just read.
Alam Ayohalahu Al Habib.
And where did you learn to read Arabic?
I learned as a boy in Timbo, in Timbuktu.
At home, we spent much of our time devoted to studying the rites of prayer and to the Quran. We learned geography, astronomy, calculations, and the languages of the nations we traded with. It was the first of my country's writing that I had seen since I left home.
I know many languages.
I told Colonel Marshak that I wanted to write a letter home, and did he know how to send it?
Andrew Marshak had recently arrived from New York State. He brought Natchez its first printing press and became its first newspaper publisher. Marshak had a nose for a good story and began printing articles that sometimes embellished and stretched the facts to call national attention to Abdul Rahman's plight.
He was a colorful personality perhaps not an intellectual, but he was a friendly, open, genuine person, and usually spoke first and thought later.
Prince is really a most extraordinary man. Born to a kingdom, well educated, he was faithful, honest, humble, and industrious. I do not look upon Prince or Abdul Rahman as a mere biped slave, but as a dignified captive, a man born to command, unjustly deprived of his liberty.
6 years passed and Abdurrahman never wrote to his family in Fouta Djallon. But a shameful scandal on the plantation would finally motivate him.
Thomas Foster Jr., we command and strictly enjoin you to answer to a bill proffered against you for keeping the basest company of habits and temperance.
Thomas Foster had a son, Thomas Foster Jr. He married well, the daughter of a local minister, but soon grew cold and indifferent to her, and she discovered why. Going around the quarters, she caught her husband, Thomas Foster Jr., in bed with a slave woman named Susie. Remarkably enough, it seems that this woman was the daughter of Abdul Rahman.
He began to see the future, and the future was what was going to happen when Thomas Foster died, and his children were going to be divided among Foster's children. And all that he had worked for in terms of stability and position for his family within that limited society was all going to be torn apart.
Maybe writing a letter home doesn't solve that problem immediately, but it was a protest, the strongest he could take, perhaps, against the situation on the plantation.
Natchez, Mississippi. The enclosed letter in Arabic was written in my presence by a venerable old slave named Prince. The object of his letter is to make inquiry after his relations with the hope of joining them. I have undertaken to forward his letter for him and committed to your care with a request that you will lend your aid to an old man's wishes. I am, sir, your servant, Andrew Marshock.
January 12, 1828, Washington, D.C. Sir, your letters have been received. The President is obliged by your attention to the subject of the Moorish slave now in the possession of Mr. Foster, the object of the President being to restore Prince, the slave, to his family and country, for the purpose of making favorable impressions in behalf of the United States. Henry Clay, Secretary of State.
Because he wrote in Arabic, Marshock and the American government assumed that Abdurrahman was a Moor and sent his letter to the Sultan of Morocco, America's oldest diplomatic ally. Having finally caught the ear of Washington, Abdurrahman chose not to correct the mistake. By 1827, Abdurrahman was in his 60s and of little economic value to Foster. After years of rejecting Cox's offers to purchase his freedom, Foster told Marshock that he would release the prince without payment, on one condition.
Be it known that I, Thomas Foster, have this day delivered unto Andrew Marshock the custody of said slave prince, for the sole and only purpose of his being transported to his native country by the government of the United States. Prince is not to enjoy the privileges of a free man within the United States of America. Thomas Foster.
Immediately a complication arose. If Abdul Rahman was going to be free, what about Isabella? He really couldn't imagine leaving her behind.
Abdurrahman began a campaign to raise funds to free Isabella from slavery. In 2 days, he collected $200 for his wife's purchase, anticipating that it would be as easy to free his children as well. Henry Clay directed Marshock to send Abdurrahman to Washington, and from there he would go to Morocco. Just before he left Natchez, Marshock presented him with the costume of a Moorish prince. He hoped to use the strange gift to his advantage. Once again, Abdurrahman faced the agony of parting from those he loved most.
The morning of my departure was beautiful, clear, and calm. As we set to go, I told my children of my care for them, and that I would buy them free at 10 prices.
I was told there was a look of silent agony in their eyes. I could not bear witness to this. Andrew Marshall.
Abdurrahman, a free man for the first time in 40 years, headed up the Mississippi River with Isabella by his side. The first stop, Cincinnati, Ohio. Impressed by the sights of this large and bustling city, it held a still deeper significance. For the first time in Abdurrahman's life, he was in a place where slavery was outlawed. Newspapers detailed Abdurrahman's prince to pauper story, and local events were organized around his visits. A bumpy stagecoach ride took them through Pennsylvania, Maryland, and later Washington, D.C. His hopes buoyed by the attention, Prince carried his subscription book everywhere, soliciting donations to free his family back in Mississippi. Secretary of State Henry Clay arranged for Prince to meet with President John Quincy Adams.
May 15th, 1828. Abdul-Rahman is a Moor who has been 40 years a slave in this country. The Emperor of Morocco expressed a wish that this man might be emancipated and sent home. I should like to oblige the Emperor.
Children, the President received me very kindly, and I expect from his kind expressions to me that he will pay every attention to my business.
Fast becoming the most popular African in America, Abdurrahman played to the press, never denying some of the more colorful descriptions of himself or his life, at least not in print.
The African prince, Abdul-Rahman, at the insistence of several of the clergy, has spent a few days in this city to receive contributions.
He has a striking face and a clear, intelligent eye.
Prince. He expresses the deepest sympathy for his children who are still in slavery.
Their emancipation would be paramount to every other consideration. Episcopal Watchman, July 4.
His visit is to avail himself to the benevolence of this community. The appeal, we are confident, will not be in vain.
Abdul-Rahman had an agenda. It's informed by a careful reading of the circumstances in which he finds himself. Exceptionality in the United States is, to his advantage.
On his return visit to the White House, Abdurrahman appealed to President Adams to contribute to the fund to free his children. Meetings with other politicians in the young capital had netted the prince several $100s. When Abdurrahman made it clear that his true homeland was not in Morocco, President Adams was less charitable.
May 22nd, 1828. The distraction of business and of visitors gave me a headache. Abdul-Rahman, the emancipated Moor, brought me a subscription book to raise a fund for purchasing the freedom of his 5 sons and his 8 grandchildren, to which I declined subscribing. John Quincy Adams, President.
Adams' lack of interest in helping to fund his children's freedom dealt a harsh blow to Abdurrahman. But there was one last group he could turn to. The American Colonization Society was a powerful organization aimed at exporting Christianity and settling America's free blacks in Africa. Thomas Gallaudet headed up the Society's Connecticut office. Abdurrahman hoped Gallaudet would enlist its wealthy members to buy his family's freedom. Believing Abdurrahman to be a Christian, Gallaudet saw in him an opportunity to use the prince's notoriety to spread Christianity to Africa. Gallaudet went as far as to give Abdurrahman a Bible written in Arabic and asked him to write the Lord's Prayer. Many years later, it was discovered that what Abdurrahman had written was actually the Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran.
This was a man who has a lot of faith, and he's committed to his principles, but he knows how to get what he wants from the system.
He has to tell a story that makes sense to the people he's talking to. So we don't know how much of what he said was just for them and how much was what he really thought in his own heart.
Abdurrahman was unable to stop the spin of events in Mississippi. When reports of his northern travels reached Natchez, he was cast as an instigator, stirring up racial troubles with free blacks and abolitionists at the government's expense.
I consider the contract entered into by the government through the agency of Henry Clay, Secretary of State, entirely violated. Prince has written several letters to my slaves stating he would procure their freedom. And if he returns here, or while he remains in the United States, I consider the said Prince my slave. Thomas Foster.
Ungrateful blackguard.
Slave owners didn't like to set slaves free. It undermined the whole system, it undermined the whole economy, it undermined their moral justification of slavery.
Andrew Jackson, a slaveholder who once lived near Natchez, stepped up his plans to defeat John Quincy Adams in the 1828 presidential election. Abdurrahman became a flashpoint for scandal and slander during the campaign.
Remember the plot of Adams and Clay to excite the prejudices of your northern brethren against the South by employing an emancipated Negro to electioneer for them? President Adams. He will get nary a vote down here.
Marshak became a staunch voice for the Southerner Jackson. And he wanted to stay on good terms with Foster and other plantation owners. As a result, he turned on Abdurrahman with a vengeance.
That's one L in ungrateful, if you please.
After months on the road, Prince's physical health was failing. Fevers forced him to cancel appearances. Funding from the ACS came up short, and public support to buy his children's freedom dried up.
Andrew Jackson of Tennessee had been elected president. He would take office in March of 1829. It just seemed advisable, perhaps, to get overseas at this point.
The Jackson election was evidence of a deepening split in the country, and black Masons lost no time in rallying behind Abdurrahman. A powerful political force, the Free Blacks of Boston had invited Abdurrahman to their city. It would be his last appeal. David Walker, one of the country's most respected and feared anti-slavery advocates, warmly welcomed the prince to the African Masonic Lodge. Walker's fiery abolitionist articles ignited deep-seated fears in slaveholders throughout the South.
Our
worthy guest. Abdul Rahman was by African natural enemies torn from country, religion, and friends. May God enable him to obtain so much of the reward of his labors as may purchase the freedom of his offspring. A salute and tribute to the complete success of the philanthropic undertakings of Prince Abdul Rahman and the Manumission Society.
Brethren, this token of respect which this day you have been pleased to confer will ever be held by me. Isabella, in grateful remembrance. It is time to leave this place.
After 10 grueling months, Abdul Rahman and his wife, Isabella, had raised only half the funds needed to free their children. With heavy hearts, they made arrangements to leave the country for good.
Do not be too hard on yourself. We did all we could do.
Abdul Rahman crossed the Atlantic Ocean yet again, this time on a passenger ship named the Harriet. Traveling in their best cabin, compliments of the United States government and the American Colonization Society. On March 18, 1829, after 40 years and a lifetime away, Abdul Rahman returned to Africa. Stepping ashore in Monrovia, Liberia, he laid down his prayer mat and openly bowed in prayer. As he planned his journey home to Timbo, his thoughts turned, as always, to his children.
Please inform all my friends that I am in the land of my forefathers, and that I expect my friends in America to use their influence to get my children for me, and inform them of my arrival in the colony, Abdul Rahman.
Abdul Rahman lived for 4 months before he contracted a fever and died at the age of 67. He would never see his beloved Fouta Jalan or his children again.
I almost felt the spirit of my ancestor just overwhelming me to say, you know, do this because it's important that you know where you come from. I came to Natchez with a very old car that broke down from Chicago all the way, but I was determined to be here. I told myself, if Abdul Rahman could survive on a slave ship to bring him to the U.S., why more about me with an old car? I will come. One of the things that I have realized finding them is how do they connect to their past, to realize that their history did not begin in slavery, but in freedom.
My grandmother was Susan Collins Foster.
Ruth Foster Harris was my grandmother.
My great-grandmother was Susan Collins.
I'm the granddaughter of Ruth Foster
Grandson
Harris.
of Clark Elder and Prince Collins.
My mother named me Prince, and I named my son after me to the third.
I am the son of Clark Elder Collins.
My father's name is Prince Collins
I'm the son
Jr.
of Prince and Nazarene Collins.
My father's name Willie Foster. His father's name Scott Foster. And his daddy was named Albert Foster.
My father is John Foster, and
I'm the granddaughter of Clark Elder Collins.
I'm the granddaughter of Prince and Clark Elder
I am the son of Clark Elder and Prince Collins.
I am the grandson of Stuart and Susan Foster.
I'm the granddaughter of Clark Elder Collins.
I'm the daughter of Prince Collins III.
My great-grandfather, Prince Collins.
My grandmother, daughter of no other than Simon Rahman, who lived in Liberia.
I'm the granddaughter of Clark Elder Collins and Prince I'm the daughter Collins. of Anita Collins.
My grandmother's name was Lizzie Foster Johnson.
And my grandmother's name is Rosetta Harris.
I'm the daughter of Clark Elder and late Prince Collins.
And my mother's name is Emma Harris, and my grandmother's name is Rosetta Harris.
I'm the daughter of Clark Elder Collins and the late Prince Collins.
Great-grandson of Daniel Collins and Amelia Collins.
I'm the daughter of Benny and Mary Collins and the granddaughter of Clark Elder and the late Prince Collins.
For more information on Prince Among Slaves, please visit pbs.org. This program is a presentation of the National Black Programming Consortium. Funding for this program has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, because democracy demands wisdom, and by the following: Sohail and Mona Massoud, the Al Hibri Charitable Foundation, Safi and Anita Qureshi, Hisham Al-Rai, Atif Abdul Malik, Sajid and Simi Sayed, Shakil Ahmed and Faria Abedin, Maqsood and Rafiq Chowdhury, Akif Ahmed, Badsha and Aisha Wazir,